As you heard before at the start of the show, we have guests joining us online, joining us by phone. I'm going to very quickly introduce them. I think you've all probably heard of both of them. Mollie Hemingway, she's a senior journalism fellow at Hillsdale College. She's a Fox News contributor, a senior editor at The Federalist. You see her all the time on Fox News. She's just and her writing is always brilliant and wonderful and insightful. And then also Carrie Severino. Carrie Severino, previous law clerk to Clarence Thomas, which is truly amazing thing. She's also a contributor to National Review and chief counsel and policy director of the Judicial Crisis Network. These two women together wrote this book. I want to hold up so you can see it. This should be your beach reading in August, folks. It reads like almost like a fiction, and it flows, but it's a factual, substantive, serious report on the Justice Kavanaugh confirmation hearing. It's called Justice on Trial, the Kavanaugh Confirmation and the Future of the Supreme Court. Mollie and Carrie, hello.
Great to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks to have, just so glad to have both of you on. I really, really appreciate that. Well, America was riveted to our TV screens in the summer of 2018, watching Judge Kavanaugh in his hearing before the United States Senate, his confirmation hearing after he'd been nominated to be elevated to the Supreme Court. So I'm going to go back and forth. You both have a fount of knowledge and world of experience on these kinds of issues, but I want to just start with the background, how you start, basically talking about many players on the American left had decided, even before President Trump announced which person he was going to choose to nominate to fill the seat being vacated, and it was but there were efforts to come out against the nominee even before the nominee was named. And Mollie, let's just start with you. Can you describe a little bit about this well-funded effort to get after whoever Trump is going to nominate?
Yes, people think that the Kavanaugh confirmation process broke down in September when allegations of sexual misconduct came out. But actually, the whole thing was crazy from even before the time he was nominated. President Trump had put forth a list of potential nominees, and so people kind of knew who was in contention. It was openly discussed who were the shortlisted contenders and whatnot. Before he was even named, you had senators announce that they were going to oppose whomever was nominated by President Trump. You had people start targeting Senator Susan Collins, the Republican of Maine, with threatening packages that if she didn't vote against whoever the nominee was, that she would be that they would be coming for her. So this actually predated the Kavanaugh effort. Once he was named, that's when things really got into high gear. Within minutes, you had an orchestrated protest on the steps of the Supreme Court with pre-made signs. They threw out the ones that said, like, we hate Kethledge, and they put out the ones that said, we hate Kavanaugh or whatnot. But it was all very well organized with a lot of coordinated groups on the left.
So, Carrie Severino, I want to take a minute to talk more about the organization that you head up, your chief counsel and policy director of the Judicial Crisis Network. That's a group dedicated to strengthening liberty and justice in America, commitment to the Constitution, the founder's vision of a nation of limited government, dedicated to the rule of law. You are singing my tune, Carrie Severino. I love those principles. So I want to get with you, Carrie, this whole idea of the Democrat opposition to Justice Kavanaugh, which was just hysterically out of control. It was far more pointed and angry than was the opposition to Gorsuch, even though there was some opposition to him. But Gorsuch was going to be replacing Justice Scalia, so it was kind of one conservative end taking another conservative seat. But in this particular case, the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh was for the seat of Justice Anthony Kennedy, who is a well-known swing justice. You never could be sure which way he was going to go. Do you think that the fact that Kavanaugh would be replacing Justice Kennedy, that contribute to the hysteria on the left?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, some people would say periodically, why didn't this happen to Gorsuch? And the more people we talk to, the conclusion really is because Gorsuch wasn't replacing a seat that would cause a shift in the balance of the court. And in Justice on Trial, Mollie and I wanted to put the whole Kavanaugh confirmation in context. So we do tell the story of these previous nominations, and you can see that time and again, when the seat is high stakes, you see the the process break down and become hyper-political. So with Robert Bork, he was also replacing a swing vote on the court. So suddenly, that exploded into a historically nasty fight. With Justice Thomas, he was replacing Thurgood Marshall, who was one of the leading liberals on the court. So, of course, we see in that case as well a very similar to Kavanaugh, in fact, where there's unsubstantiated allegations against him. And a lot of people going into this process, even before the nomination was made, were worried that whoever was going to be filling the seat would see that kind of historic levels of opposition. And a lot of people speculated that there would be spurious allegations like this. So really it has a lot to do with the stakes of the seat, and typically not as much to do with the nominee, his or herself. Many people said this is the kind of thing that would have happened regardless of who the president nominated to the seat.
Boy, I could not agree with that more. I just really watching the spectacle of the Kavanaugh hearing, you're realizing the guy even looks kind of, he has a very gentle look about him. In fact, in your book, you talk a little bit about the years he worked in the Bush White House, is where he met his wife, and how when she first had met him in the White House, I think I don't have that page open in front of me, but it was something to the effect of she thought he seemed a little bit too nice when she was considering potentially dating him. Is that, do I have that right? Do you remember that?
She said it was, or the way that it was described as nice, perhaps too nice. But that's what so many people thought about him. He had friendships going back decades into junior high school with women who absolutely adored him and thought he was an incredible man, a very good friend. We interviewed many of his ex-girlfriends and talked to them about how he treated them. This was completely, for them, when the allegations came, just completely outside the realm of the possible for them to even imagine. One woman said that there were maybe 5 men, possibly only one, who she would have come out and defended so vigorously, and Brett Kavanaugh was one of them. So he built up an extremely good reputation among a very wide group of friends of all political persuasions, by the way. Like, many of his friends were not in any way conservative or right of center. And that ended up really helping him. He mentions it in his opening hearing, that how much he values his friends, but they come to become a very important part of his defense when people start making allegations against him without any evidence to support these allegations.
Yep, I was thrilled for him. He led a life like that. It got him to the place where he had those people who didn't have to be arm twisted and talked into defending him. They wanted to speak up for the person they knew. So I'm going to head back to Carrie here. Since your organization focuses on the judiciary, I had not realized until reading your book that you actually talk about Supreme Court justices, or nominees rather, go around to the Senate offices, at least of the majority or the party that nominated you, but go around to those offices and have substantive, in-depth conversations, or whatever it is, kind of conversations the senators want to have with the nominee about their views on a variety of things. And you mentioned Rand Paul wanted to talk about, with Judge Kavanaugh, about his more deep understanding of his view of the Fourth Amendment and search and seizure, and Ted Kennedy Ted Cruz. Let me correct myself. Ted Cruz actually went through some practicing kind of things. So, Carrie, is this a common thing that the nominees really have in-depth conversations with senators?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's one of those areas that people don't see as much of. It's kind of, typically you see someone when the day they're nominated and the president walks out and they give a little speech, and then there's this kind of go dark, and then you finally see the nominee again at the hearing. This is what's going on in that time. He's preparing for his hearing. So, he would kind of split his time. In this case, he would be meeting with a senator maybe in the morning, and then in the afternoon would be discussing some substantive area of law to make sure he was up on for any questions he'd get. And those meetings were very helpful for that process too, because it gave him an idea of what is important to the senators, what do they want to talk about. It was interesting too, though, because normally he would have met with more members of the minority party, but for a long time they were boycotting those meetings. So until August, there was only one Democrat senator who was even willing to meet with him before August. Chuck Schumer had kind of declared a boycott. And then finally, in the last weeks before the campaign, before the hearing, he was at least able to meet with the members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Democrats, and a few others. But that's something that really helped prepare for the process, as well as it was a great opportunity for certain key senators like Susan Collins to develop a connection with him that really carried through the rest of the process. So she's someone who spent one of the only people who maybe spend as much time as the nominee himself preparing. She hired extra staff so she could read through his opinions. He was not a lawyer and wanted to make sure she was understanding them well. She learned them down to the footnotes, and they spent 2 hours going through all of his record. And so that connection, they really, it felt like they understood each other at the end. I think that also provided a great foundation when later things got crazy, for her to be able to say, okay, I want to sit down and really make sure I'm applying this same systematic approach now to these allegations that I did to learning about his record.
Carrie, I'm glad you gave that summary. And Susan Collins was my next subject. It's interesting. She happened to attend the same undergraduate school that I did in upstate New York, St. Lawrence. And I know there was a group of students from St. Lawrence who organized, and that they were on a mission to advocate to her that she turned down Kavanaugh because of all these spurious allegations. I just could hardly believe it. But she came around. But Mollie, I want to ask you about Susan Collins. She obviously played just a pivotal role. There was so much attention focused on her by the left and by the right, people pushing to encourage her to vote no and to vote yes. And it was all happening in the context of the Me Too, kind of the heyday of the Me Too time, when that was a big issue where people just, the left was almost kind of arguing once an allegation is made, it must be treated as true. And so that was played into all this. But what do you think finally swayed Susan Collins to vote yes?
I think it was just that Susan Collins approached everything quite differently. I mentioned that she was targeted before Kavanaugh was even nominated. This totally goes against her idea about what a senator should be. She takes her job very seriously, that the advise and consent role that she is given according to the Constitution is extremely important. And so no matter who is nominating a potential justice, she evaluates their record without pressure. She does not appreciate being pressured from the outside. She likes to just evaluate what's going on. And so for her, she really did just study up on everything that he had written, all of his opinions, his speeches. She hired additional staff. Carrie was talking about it, like her level of knowledge down to the footnotes. She really took her time and grilled him on the issues that were important to her. And that was how she made her decision. The harassment that she and her offices received was really horrific. There were threatening packages, threatening phone calls. One of her staffers, was this young woman whose job was to, help out with Social Security claims, was threatened with rape and murder, and just horrible things happening over the phone. And the staffer ends up quitting. She thought, how interesting that in the name of women's rights, you have men calling her female staff and getting them out of public service, through this harassment and bullying. She was the last senator on earth to respond to that type of pressure. Very different from the way we saw other senators who were quite malleable, people like Jeff Flake or whatnot, who could be cowed pretty quickly by even the slightest bit of protest.
This, so back to Carrie, this Christine Ford, this professor and Dr. Ford, who brought the central allegation that was, was the subject of the hearing in the Senate related to Kavanaugh's nomination, and she, was making an allegation about conduct allegedly having occurred decades ago during high school. Did you get the sense, Carrie, that the senators were less willing to even question her about its, I know that the senators end up hiring a woman lawyer to question her, but did you get the sense that she was handled really more with kid gloves, afraid to talk to her and to press about inconsistencies in her story because of the Me Too movement being so high-flying at that point?
Yeah, that certainly played a role, as well as their knowledge that anything they did that was even just questioning whether what she was saying was true, even if it's not attacking her personally, would be nonetheless portrayed in the media and by other groups as attacking her in some way. So even just saying, "Are you sure about this fact?" It would have been, it was very difficult. So they had to be incredibly careful. That's part of the reason that while they had lots of information about her that was at odds with the way she was being portrayed in the media, whether it was, the fact that she was known as a heavy drinker, or the fact that that many people described her as actually very sexually aggressive with boys, they didn't want to go touch that with a 10-foot pole, and so they were very careful not to bring any of that in at all. And that was a conscious decision on the part of the senators as well as on the White House to be very careful there and just focus as much as they could on trying to be very careful about how they explained the story did not have support.
Carrie, as a quick follow-up, you and Mollie interviewed so many people in the writing. Again, we're speaking with both of Mollie Hemingway and Carrie Severino, authors of the book Justice on Trial. Roughly speaking, how many people did you interview in order to get the full flavor of what happened around the Kavanaugh hearing, Carrie?
It was over 100 people, and for hundreds of hours, because some of these were hours and hours of interviews, because it was an incredibly, it was a dramatic process for everyone involved, and we're talking with a lot of people who were very close to it. So we were going through this story repeatedly. We had one day that was wild where we, I think about 7 o'clock in the morning, interviewed a senator from the Senate Judiciary Committee, went from there to a high-level White House official who we talked to for several hours, went from there to the Supreme Court, talked to the Supreme Court justice for several hours. So we really wanted to make sure we got the fullest picture possible of this story, and it was an amazing experience to be able to have that kind of access.
Oh, it's just amazing. It's just a great book and a great way of summarizing things. Mollie, I want to ask you, in addition to Christine Blasey Ford, there were other women who came forward once this thing got going, other women who came forward with increasingly wild claims of inappropriate conduct by Justice Brett Kavanaugh. And I wonder if you could just tell our listeners what happened to those stories. Like, they came forward, some of them were completely debunked, or they even volunteered that, as it turns out, it wasn't true. Can you quickly describe what happened with those other stories, and are those women now facing charges?
Right. There were a series of increasingly outlandish claims that were put forward. None of them, including the original claim, had corroboration to convince anyone that any of these claims were true. But they got, the third major claim was that Brett Kavanaugh had run a serial gang rape cartel as a high school student in the suburbs of Maryland. This was put forth by Michael Avenatti, and he claimed that he actually had the woman sign an affidavit, and he said he had a witness, although the witness said that she was mischaracterized. They were referred to the Department of Justice for investigation of a crime for making a false statement, as were a few of the other people who made claims without evidence that were deemed to be false. But nothing has happened to the people who made the false claims, to my knowledge. Obviously, Michael Avenatti is in a host of other trouble with federal officials, but not for that. But what I also think is interesting is the media claims that they really suggested that with more time they could really nail down these allegations. But as soon as he was confirmed, as soon as Justice Kavanaugh was confirmed, they just kind of dropped the story entirely. There have been no additional allegations. They didn't seem to have the same level of interest. It almost seems like they were just also participating in a partisan attempt to keep him off the court. Journalistically, they just, you would think that if it were big news that someone who might be on the Supreme Court had done these things, it would be much bigger news that someone who was on the Supreme Court might have done these things, and therefore it would have meant that they should have had a ton of reporters working on it. So if they haven't found anything, they should have reported that, and if they aren't looking, that really makes it seem like they weren't really doing honest journalistic investigations to begin with.
That is an understated truth. Yes, right. I could not agree more. Carrie, I want to go back to you. I so appreciate this organization you work with to ask you, I've heard people say that because the Kavanaugh hearing in particular was so outlandish, filled with false allegations and grandstanding and hysterical comments by people, mainly on the Democrat side and on the Judiciary Committee as they're working to try to oppose Justice Kavanaugh. And, the kind of scenes the Spartacus type scenes we all were kind of watching and shaking our heads. I've heard people suggest that maybe the better solution in the future is that we don't have to have hearings in the Senate. You have the constitutionally required Senate must, consent, must give its confirmation of a nominee for the Supreme Court once the president has made the nomination. But maybe we should just eliminate the whole idea of having public hearings and television cameras in there and recordings of it, because you're going to end up with, as you had in this case, potential Democrat presidential candidates grandstanding for the camera. So what do you think about just eliminating the idea of hearings entirely?
Well, it's interesting. There was, after the Bork nomination, there was actually a commission set up to try to find ideas of how to downgrade the political nature of the process. And that's one of the recommendations that they proposed, is not having these big, made-for-TV moments. And the Senate never took them up on that idea. So I think the challenge is, it is something, and particularly this year, I mean, there were 3 members of the Senate Judiciary Committee that are running for president currently, and were known to be probably running for president at the time. So I think it's an opportunity that senators do not want to turn up for their chance to interview a future Supreme Court justice, whether they agree or disagree with them, to get their talking points in, cut tape for their campaign videos. I think that's what, Spartacus Booker, as you said, I think that's what he was going for. Obviously, that one blew up in his face. But I think that's one of the challenges, is the incentives all point to the senators wanting, they've already had more than their fair share of their 15 minutes of fame, but it's never enough. So it might be an interesting idea, and that's how for most of our history we did it. There weren't hearings like this, but I'm afraid that the senators might not see it as a win-win to get rid of them, as you or I might.
Could not pass up that camera opportunity. I agree. I think it would be a great solution. You could still have the in-depth assessment by every senator of every candidate. You could have the interviews. You could have the senator's office issuing statements. But once you take away the grandstanding and the cameras and their 5 minutes of fame, I think you'd have a more serious and substantive process. But I agree. It's probably not going to ever fly for that way, for the reasons you said. Mollie Hemingway, Carrie Severino, I told you before we came on air, I could talk about this book for about 3 hours. I think it is so good, so well written, so it's actually entertaining, informative. Again, for our listeners, we're speaking to Mollie Hemingway, Carrie Severino, authors of this book, Justice on Trial, The Kavanaugh Confirmation, and the Future of the Supreme Court. Great book. And Mollie and Carrie both, thank you so very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Folks, I'm telling you, that was just a great thing these 2 women did. One thing, I heard some other interview they did, so I'll just pass along this one point they made, which is they got really determined to do this book because prior, in previous times before in the Senate, when there was a big and kind of acrimonious Senate process for confirming a judge, that so much time went by before people had the opportunity to assess what the witnesses were saying, with the validity of it, and it was especially making reference to the Anita Hill, the confirmation hearing in which Justice Clarence Thomas was, kind of broadsided, attacked by Anita Hill, and it seemed that for so long, I mean, there are books about it now and much later, but there weren't books at the time, and for a long time, a lot of people thought, well, gee, I don't know, maybe she's telling the truth, maybe she's not. And I think that for many people, when the facts came out more clearly and fully, they realized that they did believe Justice Clarence Thomas, that they did think Anita Hill was not being honest in her testimony. And these ladies are saying this guy, Brett Kavanaugh, to be really clear, folks, was completely railroaded, not just by Christine Blasey Ford, but by the other women making false accusations, by the mob of the American left, who decided even before his nomination was in, before his name was put out, that he was going to be the victim of just unbelievable media mobbing, and Democrats in the Senate Judiciary Committee just endless, ridiculous questions and conjecturing and just finding any way to destroy him. And these ladies said they wrote this book in the pretty speedy time that they did, because this confirmation was in 2018. We're just a year later now. They said it's only, to be fair to him, to get the facts out, all of these facts. The book is fact-filled. I went on a quick fact. It was kind of fun in the book, and then I really do urge you to get it. But Brett Kavanaugh met his wife, Ashley, when they were both working in the Bush White House. And they met, and their very first date was a late dinner on September 10th, 2001. Let that sink in. Very next day, go to work at the White House. And September 11th happened. Obviously a major attack. Everybody's rushed out of there, but that is how they met. And, she, the wife, is a just lovely, bright, competent, lovely person who just could hardly believe the way her husband was treated. And so again, for that reason alone, and just for the ability, when you've had your character besmirched on national television, and the moment you're confirmed, as they were pointing out, the moment he was confirmed, all of the accusers, all of the attackers, all of the media, all of these other organizations on the left that worked so hard to attack him, all of them instantaneously said, okay, never mind, we drop it. He gets confirmed, the end, which tells you a lot about how much they actually believe in the allegations that they were making. They didn't even make an effort, not even an effort, to go after him once he was confirmed. So these ladies, these two authors, Mollie Hemingway and Carrie Severino, did a great job writing a book, explaining the details, and really kind of putting it out there for people who want to know the truth, what exactly happened, all of the behind the scenes instances and incidents. It's just a great book.